Christabel Bielenberg is an Englishwoman of Irish stock who lived in Nazi Germany from 1932 until 1945. Born Christabel Burton, a niece of Lord Northcliffe, she married Peter Bielenberg, a German lawyer, in 1934. In a book called The Past is Myself, which was published some years ago, she gives a riveting account of what it was like to live under Nazi rule. Her husband was arrested after the failure of the plot against Hitler's life, and she herself was interrogated by the Gestapo. A reviewer in The Economist, writing in 1982, said of her book that it deserved recognition as a magnificent contribution to international understanding and as a document of how the human spirit can triumph in the midst of evil and persecution. Christabel Bielenberg, you're welcome to the program. I said that an Englishwoman rather, of Irish stock, married to a German, quite a complicated and increasingly complicated picture.
Well, I suppose it is really, yes. I mean, my family arrived in Southern Ireland, my father's family, in 1610. Of course, still blow-ins, as you know, they were called, but still it was 1610. And my grandmother came from from Armagh, actually, from Armagh, she was northern. And, in fact, took her whole family over. The family of her eldest son was Northcliffe. Took them all over because of Fenian troubles in 1870, if one can believe it, or 1860 even, I think. And where they founded the empire of the press, one could say. He certainly did. And my mother was the youngest of that family and was therefore born in England. And therefore, naturally, I have great feeling and also great connection somehow with not only Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, but also England. Of course, I was born there and brought up. In fact, a very funny story, perhaps I should tell you. And I was very, very interested in involved also with the women's peace movement in the North. I thought, here is something, I mean, this might take off. And I was outside the peace house, where I parked my car, obviously in a very wrong place, and suddenly there was a hammering on the door, and I came out, and there were an awful lot of soldiers around my car and at the crossroads, awful lot of British soldiers. And a very nice young lieutenant came up and asked me where I came from, and I said County Wicklow. And he said, well, would I open the boot? And I did. And would I open the bonnet? And I did. And then he said, now please take all the seats out of the car. Whereupon, there were about 14 very healthy-looking men standing around. So I said, no, listen, you have at least a dozen extremely healthy young men here. I'm damned if I remove those cushions. And he looked at me and said, where did you say you came from? And I said, County Wicklow. God, he said, I would have thought you were one of us. Of course, it's my accent. And so I said, well, listen, if you want to put me if I want to put you in a real muddle, I married a German. Whereupon the poor young man said, oh, God, I wish we'd never started this.
I bet he did.
So that's really the mixture story.
But how did you wind up in Nazi Germany? You went to Oxford, but you didn't study there. You had
no, I tell you, I won a scholarship to Oxford from school. But my dream was to become a singer, the greatest dramatic soprano of all time in my mind. And so I gave up the scholarship to someone else took it who'd come second on the list, and I went to Germany and studied under Frau Schadow, who was the teacher of Lotte Lehmann and Elizabeth Schumann, who were two very fine singers in those days. And well, I started singing, yes, it was in 1931, and then I met my husband. And if you see him, Andy, you knew what happened to me, because he's a very handsome fellow. And we married then in 1934. We got engaged and married in 1934.
Did he insist that you give up singing, or?
No, I don't think he would have. I don't think he liked the idea. He always said, well, fetching you from the opera, things like that. He didn't sort of really... Also, he was a lawyer. He had his own sort of, his own aims in mind. And he was a student, of course, of law at the time. And we were both very young, I have to say. And then the children came along fairly soon, and so it really fizzled out a bit. one could say, with the singing.
One thing which gives me great insight into that period in your book is the story about your husband being told by his father not to go into politics, to stay away from politics. And one has the impression that that was true of many people in Germany at the time, and that was part of the problem, that people who should have been involved politically weren't.
I think that's absolutely true. See, after the inflation, the middle classes in Germany were ruined. My father-in-law had lost every bit of savings that he had in the inflation, and the parties changed so often from one to the next that certainly his thoughts, and he absolutely impressed on my husband, don't go into politics, it's a dirty game. And my husband never would have thought of going into politics at all. In fact, just when we met together, just shortly before Hitler came to power, I remember he was my fiancé at the time, dragging him off to one of these National Socialist rallies. And he came, and I was learning German with a family that was Nazi. And I was rather interested as an outsider. And he came, and I can remember him taking me out after about 10 minutes and saying, after Hitler had started off with this immense Austrian accent and all this sort of drama that went on, and he took me outside and he said, now listen, Chris, you may think that the Germans are political fools, but they're never going to fall for that clown. And 2 months later, Hitler was in power. He was Chancellor. That was 2 months before. Nobody ever it's snobbish perhaps to say so, but of his class dreamt that that would happen.
What kind of people were the Nazi leaders? I'm thinking of that famous argument by George Steiner that, you know, if these people were highly cultivated, if they listened to Mozart and read Goethe and so on, then why culture in view of the things they did?
They certainly weren't cultured. I mean, they were, difficult to say really, they were all, the original people in his party were failed people who'd failed in some kind of a way. They were mostly what we call middle class, of the sort of shopkeeper, that variety, and they were most of them failures, and joined on with this party. To my mind, I mean, this is what I think. I think it was a revolution of the middle classes, National Socialism. They had the communists at one side in opposition, and I think they were just as brutal as any communists would be at all. I mean, once they got really roused. And one has to remember they'd lost everything. They'd lost a war, the First World War. They'd lost every bean they had in the inflation, and Hitler gave a little piece to every one of them. He told them they'd been dishonored by losing the war and had never really lost it, and so forth and so on, and that the politicians and the Jews, of course, were responsible for the inflation, and that he promised to give them back an army, their honor. He knew exactly how to speak to those kind of people.
How about the growth of prejudice in the 30s? Because I often think that looking at it from the outside, that we often tend to be very superior as to how we'd behave in that kind of situation. It must have been a growing, creeping thing, or was it?
How do you mean, a creeping?
The growth of prejudice itself with regard to
well, I'll tell you, I think in honesty that I was very liberally brought up. And I do remember very well when I first came to Germany that people would say, oh, you know, he's a Jew. They didn't say it in a nasty way, but they'd say, the banker or whatever, of course he's a Jew. I never thought in those terms myself. But the Weimar Republic had been very free with Jews. I mean, all the Jews had come in from the East, from the pogroms in the East, had landed in Germany. And there was a certain feeling, I mean, for instance, the percentage of doctors and so forth were very high, or lawyers or judges, much, much higher than in England. Whereas, of course, in England they used their own particular method of, one can say, keeping Jews out. But I mean, you had to have an interview. Therefore, after you'd had your law exams in England, you had to go through the dinners and the interview, and you could be turned down for no reason at all. Therefore, there were very few Jews in those positions, a lawful lot in Germany, certainly in Hamburg.
But how exceptional did you feel as a liberal in that middle-class society?
Well, it was a strange feeling for me because I wasn't German at that time. I mean, I looked upon it rather as, well, this is something that's not really my business. I mean, it's quite interesting, and the Germans love marching about, and they marched about every weekend, the communists in one part of the town and the Nazis in the other, and there was terrible ructions every weekend. But I used to think, well, this is German, this is not me. I didn't think about it until after I got married, really. In fact, I was thinking about my singing and also about getting married, but I can't say that I really felt involved with Germans until after I got married.
Did you feel a war was on the way?
Yes, I think my parents definitely. One always hoped, not unlike today, really, one always hoped that it would be all right, somehow that it would clear. But my parents, when I got married, were, especially my father, was very, very unhappy about the whole thing because of that. Not unhappy because it was Peter, but unhappy about the situation which might develop.
What are your recollections of the outbreak of war itself?
Well, it was one of those things that one had always hoped would not happen. And I can remember that hearing of the war over the radio in Berlin. And it was a very strange feeling indeed. I felt I'd somehow straddling a fence. I didn't know where I was, really. It was so definite. If Germany does not withdraw her troops from Poland, we are at war. And I can remember thinking, well, I suppose, yes, they must be, and it's going to be. And so the first thing I did, I remember, is I jumped to the telephone, because I could telephone with my parents, and I jumped to the telephone, and I got as far as Holland. And then somebody, I mean, it was then exchanges along the line, and a Dutch woman said, but you can't telephone England. You're at war. And I can remember thinking, there was an expression, I forget who said it, the lights went out all over Europe. And I can remember that feeling coming to me, as I could get no response, of course, from England at all.
You make the point in your book that Goebbels did not get the Germans to hate, that the British needed to hate, effectively, in order to be at war at all. What are you getting at?
Well, I think that Germans, I think when I say that, I think really that Germans look upon war as a profession. At least they certainly did. I don't know what it's like. I mean, well, it's different now, surely. But in those days, war was a profession. It need have nothing to do with hate at all. Whereas the British are amateur at those sort of things. I mean, the Germans, definitely, organization is one of their things. The army was one of their things. And they could go into a war without any hatred whatsoever. There was no hatred particularly against, there was only hatred after the war against the Russians when the Russians moved in.
Whereas the British had to be worked up to fight.
Whereas the British had to be, maybe, of course, that may have been preached to me in my youth because, of course, Northcliffe stirred the British in the First World War by absurd stories in the Daily Mail and so on. But I felt that the British would have to be worked up, needed to be worked up to really want to fight, knowing they were fighting for something and had to hate to fight, if you know what I mean.
But on the other hand, the Germans stood by when dreadful things were done. I mean, how much was known? How much did you know, for example, of what was happening in the camps?
Well, this is something that I've been asked very often, and I have to, in perfect honesty, say that we knew very, very little. That something was going on, that the official story was that they were being transported to Poland, to the Generalgouvernement, where they would be in a sort of ghetto there, and they would be provided with farm machinery, and they'd got to live on the land. That was the official story. But everybody knew that it wasn't going to be a very nice happening, or it wasn't going to be very comfortable for them. But here I have to say that there is the greatest danger. You see, everything was rumour or hearsay. There was nothing in the newspapers about this at all. And a muzzled press is something. I mean, the press can go off the rails now and again, I agree. But without a free press, anything can happen. And I have to say that we, at the end of the war, when I heard about the camps, although I had visited my husband in Ravensbrück, I heard about the camps. I simply did not believe the horror stories, the lampshades with skin and all the dreadful stories. I thought to myself, oh dear, the British are starting telling exactly the same stories as we had to listen to all through the war. I mean, they're telling, it's the same kind of propaganda. I mean, it's just pure propaganda. And it was only really when the pictures began to appear, and I mean, it was absolutely irrefutable what had happened.
You had your own moment of truth when you were asked to put up two Jewish people who were looking for refuge, and obviously you were in grave danger yourself at that point. That was a real test, wasn't it?
That was a real test. I think the very first time that I realized something, I don't know why, when one's married, one doesn't think about these. We were married and young and happy and everything. I mean, one didn't think. The first time was when, when a Jewish doctor who was looking after my children suddenly told me that he could not come again because he'd been warned not to lay his hands on Aryan children. And I remember thinking, what? This is crackers. And I said, but Professor Bauer, this is ridiculous. And he said, well, if you want me to come, do please telephone. I'll know you by your voice, and I will come. And that was in 1935. That was the first warning I remember, and I also remember telephoning him, then going round to his house. He'd left for Holland, and I heard that he'd committed suicide. And I think that was the moment that came to me that this was really something very, very terrible was at foot. And then, of course, during the war, and there I have to say for the Germans, there were many, many, many who looked after Jews. They had them in this, there weren't who looked after them, provided them with food cards, because after 1942, they had to wear their Jewish star here with Jude written on it. And many of them took off the stars and went underground, but had no food. And in particular case, we had a very good friend. I think this was what you were asking me about. We had a very good friend who collected food cards, and I must say it was sometimes quite difficult to give them. But she came and she brought along someone with her and asked me if I could house people in the cellar. The husband looked very Jewish. The woman had had her hair dyed and didn't look too Jewish, really. And she could be above ground, but the husband would go underground. And I had to, my husband was away, and as I was British born and everybody knew it, I went to a neighbour who I knew was in the opposition, very good friend, and asked what I should do. And he said, under no circumstances could you do it. Your children will soon find out, they're both at school, and you are endangering your whole family. And I promised to tell this little man, I remember, I promised to tell to his wife that I would tell the husband what my decision was after speaking. And it was in the blackout, and I remember his voice came out and said, came out of the darkness saying, "Und Frau Bielenberg, was haben Sie entschlossen?" which means, what is your decision? And I couldn't say no. I just said, well, a few days. I can take you for a few days. And in those few days, it was terrible. The children were saying, "Why can't we go to the cellar? I've always had Nicky always did the heating, you know." It was chaos, and I suppose they realized that. And the woman was charming, and it was very, very nice. And I never saw the husband. And then one morning I went down to take him his breakfast. We used to put the breakfast at the door, and she didn't seem to be up, I thought. And I took the breakfast, and there was nobody there. I opened the door, there was nobody there. and they had gone of their own accord. And I afterwards heard from this friend who fetched the food cards that they had been caught buying a ticket at the station for some place. And I think that was the moment, I have to say, when I really not only realized what National Socialism was about fully, but also hated it with a deep hatred. Because, you see, Hitler had involved me in murder. Nothing less.
That's 40 years ago. And I sometimes wonder, with someone like yourself, is there a sense in which you feel you lived all of life in that period? I mean, you know, what's been happening in 40 years? Do you relive it, or to what extent has it gone from you?
I think in reality it was very good I wrote about it, because it had a cathartic effect. I'd packed it away in a corner, quite frankly, after the war. And of course, after the war, British wives were Operation Woman and Child, and we were all flown back to England very quickly. And as soon as I hadn't seen my relations for 6 years and so on, and I wanted to know where my brothers, who'd fought on the other side, had fought in Africa, whether they were alive. I knew nothing. So, of course, I was very happy when we were transported back to England. And then when we got back to England, and they all were alive, I was very lucky, I realized that I couldn't go back again, because Germany was in a state of war, and I'd left my husband behind. So I have to tell you, it was absurd, really. But I mean, by that time, I have to say, having lived through in a lawless time, one has no feeling for law at all. One says, well, listen, how can we wangle this one? And quite frankly, my wangle was, well, it was very lucky, because David Astor, who was the editor of The Observer at that time, said, well, listen, the only way of getting you back is as a war correspondent. Get into uniform, get your British nationality back, which we could in those days, and I'll send you back in uniform. And so, I'd only been in England for 3 months, and everything was in order, and I'd found schools for the children and so on. And I reappeared in Germany dressed up in uniform. And my poor husband, I think, must have nearly fainted, because I only sent him a telegram arriving Hanover there and there. He appeared to fetch me and was almost about to leave the airport, because he didn't recognize me. Of course, I was around with a lot of soldiers. However, I mean, we even got over that hump, and he became my chauffeur, and a very good friend of mine became my secretary, so that they could all get beautiful Allied rations. And we toured around Germany together. And of course, I found it much easier, really, to collect news for The Observer, which I ultimately was doing, because I could speak German. I'm sort of bilingual, you know. And so, in fact, it was an extraordinary time over in Germany, with my husband not allowed into the press camp, me not allowed into my home, because British people couldn't go into German homes. So I think we posed a problem for the Americans, who ultimately allowed Peter into the press camp and me into my home, as long as I put on civilian clothes, and they really didn't know how to cope with us at all.
I'm curious, though. Here you are living a farming life in County Carlow. It can't be the most exciting life in the world. How you know, where reality is for you? Is it through going back through this period and extensions of it? To what extent have you carved a new life?
Well, it was a necessary new life, really, because, quite frankly, after the war, we had nothing but widows left as friends. All of Peter's friends had been hanged after the 20th of July. We had very few friends, and a new generation of Germans was growing up, up-and-comers, all never having ever heard of anything that the Nazis did. I couldn't listen to it, actually. And we who so suffered under the Nazis, and I knew they hadn't, because it was quite easy for me to discover I really did not like Germany after the war at all. I didn't even like the time I was there. It was a very tough time for us both, really, because I could see the Allies side of it, and as well as the German. And for Peter, it was very difficult. He had to denazify Frankfurt, was his job. Anyway, so I got a permit for him to come to England, and then we sat down in England and said, listen, I realized England would not be a place for him. I knew I wasn't going back to Germany. So I suppose it was a matter of sticking together, which we have till our golden wedding last year, and we decided on a compromise, which was Ireland, which is a country I've always loved and partly belonged to. And he always had told me how he longed to farm, although he was a lawyer. So we were still young and thought, well, why not try it? You farm and we'll try farming. And I have to say that farming for normal people, or outsiders, townies as we call them, sounds very romantic, but I can tell you it's a real slog. And particularly as we knew nothing about it. However, Peter's German was very methodically. He studied his books, and he studied his... Of course, he was an economist, too, which is incidentally quite important if you're a farmer as well. And he studied his books, and he studied this and that and the other. And slowly but surely, he built it up, I have to say, into what is now a beautiful farm, from ruins.
You have a very happy life there. In our concluding moments, Christabel, what has the entire experience meant to you? I mean, how do you carve out the keynotes of it?
Well, I think it's taught me two things. One thing I told you, that you must protest against all sorts of things much sooner than anybody did in Germany. That the freedom of the press, let it go off the rails. It must do just that, but it must be free. And the third thing, I guess, is really racial or religious discrimination. I have a horror of it. You could say wogs and eye-ties, blacks and yellows, Brits, prods and teagues, if you like. They're all discriminatory titles, and they're very, very dangerous, because I've seen it happen in Germany. It's a slippery slope, and I saw in Germany what happened when it reached as far as Auschwitz. But the beginning is discrimination, to my mind, between any religious or racial community.
Christabel Bielenberg, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.